Smoky Hill, Kansas, September 1879. The prairie grass was the color of a lion's mane, cured by a sun that had beaten down relentlessly since May. Now, in the cooling days of autumn, a man could feel the coming shift in the air, a crisp edge to the morning that was less a promise than a threat. On a quarter section of land 2 miles north of the sluggish river, Vojtěch Hrubý was painting. He wasn't painting a house, or a barn, or even a fence. He was applying a thick, white, viscous coat of paint to the side of an abandoned circus wagon. It was a gaudy relic, with faded curlicues of red and gold still visible beneath the grime. Its high, arched roof and strangely ornate window frames, a bizarre sight against the endless, practical horizon of the plains. To his neighbors, it was the act of a madman. "He's making a clown's house," said Silas Croft, a farmer whose own sod house hunkered into the earth like a patient toad. He stood with Marlin Estabrook, the local auctioneer, and a man whose opinion carried the weight of appraised value. Estabrook squinted, his face a roadmap of prairie skepticism. He was a man who understood permanence, value, and the unyielding rules of the Homestead Act. He saw none of it in the Bohemian's project. "It's foolishness, Silas. Worse than foolishness. It's a danger to his family." He gestured with a leather-gloved hand. "That thing's got more gaps than a corn crib. The first blue norther will blow it clean into the next county." Jebediah Stone, who'd lost 2 children to a winter cough in a poorly chinked cabin a decade prior, just shook his head slowly, the motion full of a grim, earned pity. "He's new. He doesn't know a Kansas winter. He's treating it like a summer picnic." The men watched as Hrubý worked. He was not slapping the paint on. His movements were slow, methodical, each stroke of the brush long and deliberate, pressing the thick liquid into the very grain of the aged poplar planks. He looked less like a settler preparing for winter and more like an artist finishing a masterpiece. Estabrook finally strode over, his boots crunching on the dry grass. "Hrubý," he began, his voice not unkind but firm, the voice he used when explaining the terms of a sale. "This won't do. You know it won't. The land agent from Hayes City was by last month. He told me himself, a wagon is not a permanent dwelling. It's a vehicle. You can't prove up your claim with it. You're painting away your family's future for a whim." Vojtěch Hrubý paused, dipping his brush back into the heavy lead pot. He was a man of few English words, his face quiet and weathered. He looked at the auctioneer, at the worried faces of the other men, and then at the gleaming, wet surface of the wagon wall. He said, in his thick accent, "The paint is the wall." The men exchanged glances. It was worse than they thought. The man was not just a fool, he was a poet, and the prairie had a way of burying poets. They left him to his strange, gleaming obsession, convinced they would be bringing charity to his shivering widow and children come January. What did this Bohemian carriage-painter, this kocharnik, understand about the physics of vapor, heat, and dryness that the most experienced sodbusters and master carpenters on the Smoky Hill River had completely missed? I'm going to tell you that story, and if you stick with me, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of building science that is as true today as it was in 1879. It's the story of how a man saved his family, not with an axe or a plow, but with a paintbrush. So, subscribe to this channel, and let's explore how the most dismissed objects can hold the most profound secrets. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Vojtěch Hrubý was not a farmer. He was not a carpenter, a blacksmith, or a frontiersman. In the old country, in a wooded valley south of Prague, he had been a kocharnik. He built and finished carriages, not crude farm wagons, but fine, enclosed coaches for traveling gentry and, most especially, the rolling, ornate homes of the Romani, the Vardos. His life had been measured in the patient layering of materials. He understood the behavior of wood under stress, the flex of a chassis, the precise balance of a wheel. But his true expertise, the skill that set his family's work apart, was in the finish. He was a master of linseed oil paints. He knew how to boil the oil with lead and manganese salts to speed its drying, how to grind pigments so fine they became one with the vehicle, and how to lay one coat upon another, each layer curing for weeks, until the shell of a wooden vardo was as seamless and impervious as a ceramic jug. His hands knew the feel of a perfectly sealed surface, a skin that shed the relentless damp of a Bohemian winter and protected the intricate carvings and vibrant colors beneath. The objects of his trade were not saws and hammers, but pots of pigment, badger hair brushes, scrapers, and pumice stones. He worked to create an envelope, a perfect shield against the slow, creeping assault of moisture. He had brought his wife, Agnieszka, and their two small children, Tomasz and Zuzana, to America for the promise of land. They arrived in Kansas with little more than his tools and a fierce, quiet determination. Their first winter, in a hastily erected claim shack of green cottonwood planks, had been a lesson in humility and terror. That winter was not a blizzard. It was a slow, grinding siege of cold. The green wood of their shack shrank as it dried, opening up 100 tiny cracks for the wind to knife through. The suffering was not loud or dramatic. It was a series of quiet, soul-crushing failures. Wojciech's thick leather work boots, left by the door overnight, grew so brittle in the cold that the soles cracked clear across the welt when he tried to put them on. Agnieszka, writing a letter home to her mother, watched the ink freeze in the metal nib of her pen, forming a tiny black icicle mid-sentence. In the morning, the tin of coffee grounds she'd left on the shelf by the wall didn't scoop. When she tipped it, the frozen grounds clattered into the pot like a handful of buckshot. They huddled around the small stove, feeding it precious, painstakingly gathered wood. Yet the heat seemed to vanish into the walls. They were warm only in a tiny circle of 3 feet. Beyond that, the cold ruled. They survived, but the memory of that pervasive, inescapable cold was seared into Wojciech's mind. He knew he could not face another winter like that. His family would not endure it. In the spring, he heard of an auction at a defunct freight yard in a town down the line. There, amidst rusting plows and broken harnesses, sat the Circus Wagon. It was from a small, bankrupt troupe that had dissolved on the trail west. To everyone else, it was junk, a garish piece of scrap good only for firewood. To Wojciech, it was a revelation. He ran his hand over the peeling paint, rapping his knuckles on the solid, double-walled construction. He saw not a ruin, but a Bohemian vardo, a coach, a structure built by men who understood movement and weather. He bought it for $3. The problem with the standard Kansas claim shack wasn't just the wind. The wind you could fight. You could stuff rags in the cracks, nail battens over the seams. The true enemy was quieter, more insidious. It was the water you carried inside. Every day, a family of 4 puts gallons of water vapor into the air of their home. Every breath exhaled is saturated with moisture. Every pot of boiling potatoes, every kettle of coffee, every pan of washing up water releases steam. In a drafty cabin, much of this moisture simply escaped, but in a cabin chinked and sealed against the wind, it became trapped. This created a pocket of warm, humid air inside the house, a high-pressure zone of water vapor. Outside, the winter air was bone-dry and cold, a low-pressure zone. Physics is relentless. High pressure always moves toward low pressure. The water vapor inside the cabin began a relentless journey outward, directly through the walls. The planks of a typical shack were a single layer of 1-inch pine or cottonwood. As the invisible water vapor migrated through the wood fibers, it traveled from the warm interior to the cold exterior. Somewhere in the middle of that 1-inch plank, it would hit its dew point. Just like morning dew forming on grass, the vapor would turn back into liquid water. But this was happening deep inside the wood itself. The walls of the cabin were becoming saturated, from the inside out. And water is the mortal enemy of insulation. Dry wood has a modest insulating value, an R value of about 1 per inch, but water is an excellent conductor of heat. Its R value is practically 0. A damp plank of wood might as well be a sheet of metal. Heat poured through the waterlogged walls, no matter how much fuel was thrown into the stove. Families like the Crofts felt it every day. Their stove would glow cherry red, but the wall just a few feet away would be coated in a layer of frost. They were trying to heat the entire state of Kansas, and they were losing. The very act of living and breathing in their home was sabotaging it, turning their shelter into a thermal sieve. Wojciech understood this in his bones, if not in the language of physics. He knew from his years of building carriages that a wooden shell had to be sealed completely. You couldn't just protect it from the rain on the outside. You had to protect it from itself. His work on the Circus Wagon was a systematic execution of this principle. He didn't just move his family in. He spent the entire autumn rebuilding it from the skin inward. First, he and Agnieszka stripped out the wagon's interior, the moth-eaten velvet benches, the small, collapsible stage. This revealed the wagon's skeleton, a sturdy frame with an outer wall and an inner wall, separated by a 6-inch cavity. This was the key. This was the space that would hold the heat. For insulation, he used what the Prairie offered. He went to the threshing floor after the harvest and gathered bushels of chaff, the light, fluffy husks of the wheat grain. He went to the rope maker in town and bought bags of tow, the coarse, cast-off fibers of flax and hemp. He spent days mixing the two, creating a loose, airy bat that was remarkably light and full of trapped air pockets. Patiently, he packed this mixture into every inch of the 6-inch void in the wagon's walls, floor, and arched ceiling. He packed it firmly enough to prevent settling, but loosely enough to preserve the millions of tiny air pockets that did the real work of insulation. While he worked, the mockery continued, now mixed with a specific, practical objection, voiced most clearly by Marlon Estabrook. The auctioneer stopped by one afternoon in October, seeing the strange project nearing its final stage. "Ruby, I'm telling you as a friend," he said, his tone earnest. "This is a folly. I spoke to the registrar at the land office. He was clear. To prove up on a homestead claim, the dwelling must be permanent. It must have foundations. It must be affixed to the land. This has wheels. They will deny your claim. You'll lose everything you've worked for. All this effort for nothing." Wojciech was standing on a small ladder, preparing the outer wall for its final treatment. He had spent weeks scraping, sanding, and filling every crack and nail hole. The old poplar planks were smooth and pale. He looked down at Estabrook, whose face was filled with genuine concern. Wojciech nodded, acknowledging the man's kindness. He gestured to the 4 large, iron-rimmed wheels. "Wheels come off," he said simply. Then he turned back to his work. This was the final, most crucial step. The paint. It wasn't just any paint. It was his own formulation, a recipe he had learned from his father. He took heavy kegs of raw linseed oil and boiled them in a large cauldron over an open fire, adding lead oxide to act as a siccative, a drying agent. The process was slow, hot, and filled with a pungent, earthy smell. The resulting oil was thick, viscous, and would cure into a hard, resilient film. Into this boiled oil, he hand-milled pure white lead pigment, creating a paint so thick it could barely be stirred. Then he began to apply it. The first coat was thinned with turpentine, acting as a primer that soaked deep into the wood fibers, sealing them from within. He let it cure for a week in the dry autumn air. The second coat was thicker, filling the grain completely. Another week of curing. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth coats were applied with the slow, patient strokes of a master. Each layer was a thin, perfect skin. When he was done, the wagon was no longer a collection of wooden planks. It was a single, seamless entity. The surface was not merely white, it was luminous, with a hard, porcelain-like gloss. The old, garish circus wagon was gone. In its place stood a strange, beautiful, and utterly impenetrable vessel. Vojtěch had built his family a lung, a structure that could hold its breath. To understand why this strange, painted wagon worked when stout log cabins failed, you have to understand the science of heat transfer and the hidden power of water vapor. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. On the prairie, settlers fought convection, the movement of hot air, by stopping drafts. But they were helpless against conduction through damp materials and radiation into the cold, clear sky. Let's talk numbers. A British thermal unit, or BTU, is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. A cord of dry oak contains about 24 million BTUs. This was a family's winter fuel budget. The question was how fast they spent it. The effectiveness of insulation is measured by its R value, its resistance to heat flow. The higher the R value, the slower the heat escapes. Dry pine wood has an R value of about 1 per inch. The 6-inch wall of Vojtěch's wagon, if it were solid dry wood, would have an R value of 6. His tow and chaff mixture, being mostly trapped air, had a much higher R value, perhaps 2.5 per inch. In his 6-inch wall cavity, that gave him an R value of 15 from the insulation alone, plus another 2 for the inner and outer wood walls. His total wall was around R17. A standard 1-inch plank cabin wall was R1, but that's only when the materials are dry. The air inside a home, warmed and filled with moisture from breathing and cooking, is a powerhouse of vapor pressure. This pressure drives water molecules through porous materials like wood. When that vapor hits the cold outer layers of the wall, it condenses into liquid water, soaking the wood and any insulation inside. The R value of water is a dismal 0.02. When the wood fibers and chaff insulation in a wall become saturated, their combined R value plummets. An R17 wall can become an R3 wall in a matter of weeks. The 24 million BTUs in the wood pile leak out 4 or 5 times faster. Vojtěch's genius was his 6-layer lead and oil paint shell. It wasn't insulation, it was a vapor barrier. But he applied it in a way no one else considered, on the outside. Modern construction puts the vapor barrier on the warm and winter side of the wall to stop moisture from getting into the wall cavity in the first place. Vojtěch's method was different. His paint created an absolutely impermeable skin on the exterior. It encapsulated the entire structure. The wood of the wagon, kiln-dried decades ago for coach building and kept dry by the paint, could not absorb moisture from the rain or snow. It was sealed. Because the entire structure was so airtight, the humidity inside did rise. But the interior walls, kept warm by the highly effective dry insulation behind them, never got cold enough to reach the dew point. There was no surface for the moisture to condense upon. The wagon behaved like a sealed bottle. The insulation stayed bone dry. The wood stayed bone dry. And because they were dry, they retained their full R value all winter long. Vojtěch wasn't just blocking the wind, he was defeating the physics of moisture transfer. His 6 coats of paint kept the R value of his walls at a constant 17, while his neighbors' walls performed at a damp, miserable R3 or R4. He was spending his BTUs 4 times slower. That was the difference between survival and misery. That winter, the Prairie did not send a blizzard. It sent a killer frost. For 7 consecutive nights in early January, the wind died completely. The sky cleared to a brilliant star-flecked blackness. With no cloud cover to hold in the Earth's warmth, heat radiated away into space. The temperature plunged. By pre-dawn, it reached 31 degrees below zero. A thick, crystalline armor of hoarfrost, 2 inches deep, grew on every fence wire, every blade of grass, every exposed surface. It was a world of breathtaking, lethal beauty. Inside the Crofts' sod house, the family huddled around the stove. Silas had to get up every 2 hours to feed the fire. The heat it produced seemed to be sucked directly into the walls. A bucket of water for washing, left only 5 feet from the stove, had a thick cap of ice on it by morning. The windows were opaque, painted over with a thick, fern-like layer of interior frost. They were burning through their woodpile at a terrifying rate. Inside the white circus wagon, life was impossibly, miraculously normal. The small pot-bellied stove murmured quietly, fed with a few small logs every few hours. The air was still and warm. Agnieszka sat near the single oil lamp, mending a tear in Tomasz's trousers, her fingers nimble and sure. The children were asleep in their small bunk, breathing easily under a single thick quilt, not the desperate pile of every blanket they owned. The windows had a fine mist on them, but no ice. The ultimate proof of this normalcy was a small, quiet act. Before going to bed, Agnieszka had mixed a sponge of yeast, warm water, and flour for the next day's bread. She left the crock on a low shelf near the inside wall, the coldest part of the wagon. In any other dwelling on the Smoky Hill, it would have been a frozen, lifeless lump by morning. Throughout the settlement, women woke to find their dough crocks frozen into a solid dome of ice that had expanded and split the pottery. In the Hrubys' wagon, the yeast did its work. In the gentle, steady warmth, the microorganisms thrived, consuming the sugars in the flour and exhaling the carbon dioxide that would make the bread rise. The sponge swelled, alive and bubbling, filling the small home with a faint, sweet, fermenting scent. It was the smell of life in a world frozen solid. Just before dawn on the 7th day of the freeze, Marlon Estabrook was in the saddle. He was riding a circuit of his property, checking on his livestock. The cold was a physical presence, a crushing weight that made the leather of his saddle creak and the iron of his bit burn. He had already found 2 calves frozen solid in the lee of a haystack. He was wrapped in wool and canvas, his face a mask of ice from his own breath, but the cold found its way in. His route took him past Hrubys' claim. He saw the wagon, a smooth, white shape, in the pale, pre-dawn light, strangely untouched by the glittering frost that coated everything else. It looked alien, a visitor from another world. As he drew alongside it, his horse, spooked by a shadow, shied sideways. Estabrook, clumsy in his thick layers, fumbled with the reins. A leather-bound tally book, where he kept his counts of livestock, slipped from his stiff saddlebag. It fell silently into the dry, powdery snow and came to rest against the wagon's massive rear wheel. He swore under his breath, the curse turning to a puff of white vapor. He swung down from the saddle, his knees protesting with a loud crack. The world was utterly silent. He bent to retrieve the book. His thick deerskin gloves were frozen into stiff, useless claws. He couldn't get a grip on the smooth leather spine. Exasperated, he pulled his right glove off with his teeth and reached down with his bare hand. As he closed his fingers around the book, the back of his hand, his bare knuckles, pressed against the painted plank of the wagon wall. He braced for the expected sensation. The searing, biting cold of a surface at 30 below zero, a pain so intense it felt like a burn. The feeling of his skin instantly trying to freeze to the wood. But it never came. What he felt was nothing. The surface was just cool. It was dry. It was smooth as glass. It felt like a stone brought inside from the porch, not an object that had sat in a killing frost for 7 straight nights. He pulled his hand back and stared at it, then back at the wagon. He looked across the field to his own well-built plank house. Its walls shimmered under a thick, white armor of rime ice. This wagon was bare. The auctioneer, the man of practicalities and proven values, stood frozen in place, not from the cold, but from a profound and sudden reordering of his understanding of the world. He forgot the book. He forgot his cattle. He walked to the small, ornate door of the wagon and knocked. The door opened, and a wave of simple, clean warmth washed over him. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove, but a gentle, room-filling warmth. Vojtěch Hrubý stood there, dressed in a simple shirt. Behind him, Estabrook could see Agnieszka at a small table, her hands covered in flour, kneading a great pillowy mound of dough. On the shelf beside her was the earthenware crock, the source of the dough, its sides still showing the high water mark of the risen yeast sponge. Estabrook's mind struggled to connect the data points: the frozen calves, his own ice-rimmed house, the bare hand on the wall, the rising bread. He looked at the quiet Bohemian, at the simple, warm scene inside. The words came to him then, a metaphor born of pure, astonished insight. "Hrubý," he said, his voice husky with cold and awe. "You didn't build a shelter, you built a lung." Marlon Estabrook, the loudest critic, became the most zealous advocate. He told the story at the general store, at the land office, at every auction he conducted. He described the feel of that wall, the warmth from the door, the rising bread. Some listened, but most were still locked in the conventional wisdom of mass and timber. The true vector for the idea's spread was a more humble agent, a man named Arthur Pence, who traveled the back roads and isolated claims of 4 Kansas counties, selling Singer sewing machines. He arrived at the Hrubý wagon in late winter to deliver a new needle plate Agnieszka had ordered. Pence, more than anyone, was an expert on the domestic conditions of the prairie. He spent his days in claim shacks, demonstrating his machines to women whose hands were often too chapped and stiff from the cold to work the treadle properly. He had seen the misery of the Kansas winter from the inside. When he stepped into the Hrubý's wagon, he was stunned. He felt the even, draft-free warmth. He saw the healthy, unchapped faces of Agnieszka and the children. He was a practical man, and he immediately knew he was standing in the presence of a solution to the single, greatest problem his customers faced. He asked Vojtěch how it was done. Vojtěch, a man of few words, explained with simple gestures. He showed Pence the thickness of the walls. He scraped a tiny, invisible spot of paint to show the layers. He explained through a mix of broken English and sketches in a notebook. The principle: seal the skin. Keep the wood dry. Dry as warm. Arthur Pence copied it all down in his route book, right next to his sales figures and customer names. The recipe for the boiled linseed oil and lead paint. The description of the tow and chaff insulation. As he continued his travels through Saline, Ellsworth, Russell, and Rooks counties, he shared the knowledge. At the end of a sale, after he'd collected his payment, he would lean in and say, "Ma'am, I saw the damnedest thing the other day. A Bohemian family living in a circus wagon, warm as toast on 10 cents of wood a day. Let me show you how they do it." He gave the knowledge away freely. He saw it as a service. Warmer homes meant happier customers, and happier customers bought more thread. By the following spring, a subtle change could be seen across the prairie. Dozens of small claim shacks, once drab and weathered, now sported a thick, glossy coat of white or gray or red-brown paint. The men had grumbled at the seemingly cosmetic work, but the women, who lived their lives inside those walls, had insisted. The results were immediate and undeniable. Families reported cutting their winter fuel consumption by half. sometimes more. The technique spread, a quiet revolution of paint and chaff, passed from one household to another, a piece of old-world wisdom finding its perfect application on the windswept plains. Vojtěch Hrubý's painted wagon was a marvel of intuitive engineering, a century ahead of its time. What he had created with his boiled oil and hand-ground pigment was a primitive but exceptionally effective air and vapor barrier. He had grasped the fundamental concept of the modern building envelope, the idea that a structure's performance is determined not by the mass of its walls, but by the integrity of its skin. Building scientists today use sophisticated membranes, tapes, and sealants to make houses airtight, measuring their success with blower door tests. Vojtěch did it with a paintbrush. His focus on a continuous, impermeable outer layer anticipated the principles of rain screen design and air sealing that would not become standard in construction until the energy crises of the late 20th century. He was a man out of time, applying the forgotten knowledge of a craftsman to solve a problem that stumped men who called themselves pioneers. The irony was lost on no one who learned the secret. The settlers on the Smoky Hill had looked at the bright, garish paint of the circus wagon and seen frivolity. They saw a clown's house, a temporary amusement, the very opposite of the sober, earthbound permanence they valued. Their eyes, trained to see strength in thick logs and deep foundations, were blind to the truth. They could not comprehend that the very thing they dismissed as decoration was, in fact, the core of the wagon's function. The smooth, glossy skin that was meant to protect the whimsical circus murals from a summer rain was the same skin that could defeat a Kansas winter. The coat of paint that kept the colors bright also kept the family warm. One layer, one substance, served both beauty and survival. On the hard, unforgiving prairie, which rewarded only what worked, it turned out that the most practical thing a man could build was also, in its own strange way, the most beautiful. The skin that kept the paint bright kept the cold out. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and practical physics valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories like it. We believe the past has lessons that are more relevant than ever. Let us know in the comments if you've ever used an old-fashioned technique that turned out to be surprisingly effective. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical practices and scientific principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative invention. While the techniques are based on historical methods, any application of building or insulation techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.